But if the most important American weapon in World War II never fired a single shot, not a tank, not a bomber, not even the legendary Montgarant. Instead, imagine a heavy green metal box with a telephone handset hanging from its side, and a long whip antenna reaching toward the gray skies over Normandy. At first glance, it looked almost unimpressive, bulky, industrial, just another piece of equipment churned out by America's enormous wartime factories. Yet in late 1944, inside the shattered ruins of Normandy, one captured example would force German intelligence officers to confront a realization far more terrifying than another Allied tank or another bomber formation, because what they held in their hands wasn't merely a radio. It was evidence that the entire battlefield had quietly changed, and Germany hadn't noticed until it was already too late. The officer's first reaction was exactly what one might expect. Another American product. Heavy, simple, built for mass production rather than elegance. The United States had become famous for overwhelming its enemies with quantity. Thousands of tanks, thousands of aircraft, millions of rifles. Surely this radio was simply another example of industrial excess. But when ignitions opened the steel casing, that assumption quickly began to collapse. Inside, they found surprisingly refined engineering. The circuitry was carefully organized. The components were rugged yet sophisticated. Most importantly, the radio used frequency modulation, a technology that dramatically reduced the static and interference that plagued battlefield communications. Even under artillery fire, even during electrical storms, even with dozens of other transmitters operating nearby, messages remained astonishingly clear. For German communication specialists accustomed to older systems, the discovery was unexpected. But it still wasn't the part that truly frightened them. The real shock came from another statistic. Captured American prisoners weren't just carrying rifles and grenades. Ordinary infantrymen, private soldiers, radio operators attached to platoons, even junior leaders, all seemed to possess these sets. Again, and again, and again. The reports arriving from different sectors all described the same phenomenon. The Americans weren't concentrating radios at headquarters. They were placing them at the very front, right where the fighting actually happened. That single observation completely overturned decades of military thinking. The officer slowly placed the radio back on the table. It suddenly no longer appeared to be a communications device. It looked like a symptom, a clue, a warning. Germany wasn't simply fighting another industrial power. It was fighting an army built upon an entirely different philosophy. This isn't really the story of a radio, nor is it a story about electronics or manufacturing. It is the story of the exact moment one of history's most successful military machines realized its own celebrated methods of warfare were becoming obsolete, because the SCR-300 represented something far larger than technology. It represented a new relationship between information, decision-making, and firepower. For centuries, armies had accepted one unavoidable truth. The battlefield was chaos. Information moved slowly. Orders moved even slower. By the time a commander understood what was happening, reality had already changed. Every successful army had learned to survive inside that uncertainty. The Germans arguably mastered it better than anyone. Their doctrine rewarded initiative. Junior officers were encouraged to think independently. Commanders expected rapid adaptation. Their famous off-track stack TIK mission command became one of the Wehrmacht's greatest strengths. But there was one problem. Initiative meant little if information couldn't move. And by 1944, that weakness was becoming impossible to ignore. Imagine a German lieutenant leading a platoon through the dense hedgerows of Normandy. The afternoon air is filled with smoke. Machine-gun-fire tears across the fields. Artillery shakes the earth every few seconds. Visibility extends only a few dozen meters before thick vegetation swallows everything. Then suddenly, through a narrow opening between the hedges, he sees it. An American machine-gun crew establishing a firing position inside a partially destroyed farmhouse roughly 500 meters away. It's a perfect opportunity. Destroy that position quickly. And his platoon survives. Fail. And dozens of his men could die. He knows exactly where the enemy is. He knows exactly what needs to happen. Yet he is almost powerless. Because knowing something, and acting on it, are two very different things. He could send a runner. A single soldier sprinting across fields swept by bullets in hopes of reaching company headquarters. If the messenger survives, if he reaches his destination, if the commander is available, if artillery batteries are ready, perhaps support will arrive. Perhaps 10 minutes later, 20 minutes later, maybe longer. By then, The machine gun has almost certainly moved. The opportunity is gone. The casualties have already happened. Minus perhaps his platoon has a field telephone instead. A thin copper wire stretches behind him toward the rear. On paper, it solves everything. In reality, it is one artillery shell away from uselessness. One passing tick, one exploding mortar, one broken tree. The fragile wire is constantly severed by the violence surrounding it. The lieutenant lifts the receiver. Nothing. Silence. No headquarters. No artillery. No reinforcements. No communication. His platoon has become an isolated island surrounded by noise. He can only see what lies directly ahead. Everything beyond that disappears into uncertainty. Ironically, this officer has exactly what German doctrine wanted him to possess: training, confidence, initiative, authority. What he lacks is a way to connect those qualities with the rest of the army. The gap between spotting a target and bringing artillery onto it can stretch into an eternity. That delay isn't merely inconvenient. It kills people. Military theorists have always called this friction the invisible force that slows every decision, every order, every response. For generations, commanders accepted friction as unavoidable. Distance created delay. Delay created mistakes. And mistakes decided wars. The Wehrmacht became extraordinarily good at fighting inside that imperfect world. Its non-coincident officers were among the best on earth. Its soldiers adapted quickly. Its officers excelled under pressure. They learned to operate despite incomplete information, despite confusion, despite isolation. Then something changed during the summer of 1944. Front line reports began describing an enemy that didn't seem constrained by those same rules. German machine-gun positions would open fire, only to receive astonishingly fast mortar bombardments. Artillery shells land with disturbing precision. American infantry seemed capable of summoning overwhelming firepower almost immediately after making contact. Sometimes it felt as though invisible observers were watching every German movement. Officers struggled to explain it. How were the Americans reacting so quickly? How could artillery respond before a report should even have reached headquarters? It almost seemed impossible, as if the Americans weren't fighting inside the same fog of war at all. As if somehow, they had discovered a way to see through the chaos itself. And the answer was already moving quietly across Normandy, strapped to the backs of ordinary American soldiers. Now imagine the battlefield from the American side. Mid-July, 1944, deep inside the maze of Normandy's bocage. Towering hedgerows divide every field into miniature fortresses. Visibility is measured in meters. Every corner could conceal an ambush. Every farmhouse could hide another machine gun. An American platoon cautiously advances through the tangled countryside. Then the silence explodes. An MG-40 erupts from a concealed hedgerow. Its terrifying rate of fire, well over 1,000 rounds per minute, shreds branches, dirt, and stone. The platoon instantly throws itself into the mud. The battlefield freezes. Every second they remain pinned down increases the odds that more German weapons will join the fight. Traditionally, the options are grim. They can charge directly into the storm of bullets, almost certain suicide, or they can begin a painfully slow flanking maneuver, one man at a time, crawling through terrain where another hidden machine gun may already be waiting. For generations, armies accepted these as the only choices. But now, something entirely different happens. Near the center of the platoon, a private carrying a 30-5- found backpack kneels beside the ditch. The weight on his shoulders isn't extra ammunition. It isn't explosives. It's the SCR-300. He removes the telephone handset from its cradle. He isn't a general. He isn't even an officer making some grand strategic decision. His role is much simpler. He is a connection. Calmly, he speaks only a few words. A map coordinate. A target description. Nothing dramatic. No shouting. No lengthy conversation. Then, silence. 1 minute passes. Perhaps 2. The Germans continue firing, certain they have trapped another light platoon. Then comes an entirely different sound. Not aircraft. Not engines. A distant whistle growing rapidly louder. Artillery. Dozens of shells descend almost simultaneously. Not scattered randomly across the countryside. Not fired in blind hope, but concentrated with astonishing precision onto the exact hedgerow containing the German machine gun. The position disappears beneath explosions. Earth erupts. With splinters, smoke consumes everything. When the barrage ends, the MG-42 is silent. The American platoon rises and continues moving forward. That wasn't luck. It wasn't coincidence. It wasn't superior courage. It was a system. For perhaps the first time in military history, the ordinary infantryman had become something far greater than a rifleman. He had become the eyes of an entire army. The moment he identified a threat, America's enormous artillery network could see it too. Minus that seemingly small change triggered consequences far beyond a single firefight. The SCR-300 and its smaller companion, the SCR-536 handy-talkie, didn't simply improve communication. They fundamentally rewired the battlefield itself. For decades, artillery relied on dedicated forward observers. Highly trained specialists climbed church towers, occupied hilltops, or vulnerable observation posts with clear views across the battlefield. Their job was dangerous because they had to remain stationary, and they often operated far away from the infantry actually making contact with the enemy. By the time they identified targets, the battle might already have shifted. The radio changed all of that. Now the observer wasn't sitting safely behind the lines. He walked beside the lead squad. He crawled through the same mud. He saw exactly what the rifleman saw. When bullets struck around him, he was already in position. His reports were no longer educated guesses based on maps. They were lived descriptions from the point of contact itself. American artillery was transformed. Instead of functioning as a blunt instrument designed to saturate large areas, it increasingly behaved like a precision tool. Targets appeared. Coordinates were transmitted. Shells arrived. The delay that once consumed 10, 20, or even 30 minutes could now shrink to only a few. On a battlefield where firefights were often decided within minutes, that difference was enormous. The battlefield had become something no previous generation had experienced. It was beginning to function like a nervous system. Every platoon could detect danger. Every radio could transmit information. Every artillery battery could respond. Information no longer crawled. It flowed. Minus as the campaign continued. The network expanded even further. Communication no longer linked only infantry to artillery. It began connecting every combat arm together. Near sight-low, one American platoon found itself trapped by a hidden German PaK-40 anti-tank gun concealed inside a stone barn. Its shells prevented any advance. Assaulting the position directly would be catastrophic. Fortunately, a Sherman tank was supporting the attack roughly 100 yards behind the infantry. But the tank commander faced a completely different problem. Sealed inside layers of steel armor, his vision was astonishingly limited. He peered through narrow periscopes. From his position, the barn looked completely ordinary. He couldn't identify the hidden gun. He couldn't see the threat. Meanwhile, the platoon leader lying in a ditch possessed an SCR-536. He didn't need to dispatch a runner across open ground. He didn't need elaborate hand signals. He simply pressed the transmit button. Gibraltar 6. This is Doghorn. Target. Stone Barn. Traverse left. Up 2. Fire. Inside the Sherman. The gunner calmly adjusted his sights according to directions from a man he couldn't even see. Seconds later, the 70-5mm cannon thundered. The shell smashed directly into the barn. The concealed PaK-40 vanished beneath collapsing stone and timber. The obstacle disappeared almost instantly. For perhaps the first time in history, infantry had become the